My twin sister didn't just ignore me, she actively deleted me from reality, right there in the middle of a crowded airport check-in line. She thought she had won, that I would simply melt away, but a billionaire standing behind me, a complete stranger, whispered a single, impossible sentence that changed everything. Trust me, she'll regret it. I am Maya Holloway, 35 years old, the twin who always took up less space. For years, I perfected the art of quiet existence, believing that if I remained small, I wouldn't disrupt the fragile peace our family maintained since our mother died 9 years ago. I was the sensitive one, the silently observant one, the necessary shadow Lauren required to shine. My deepest fear was being discardable, a fear Lauren had masterfully cultivated. I was trapped by the belief that if I occupied too much space, I would only get in the way. That moment of public humiliation wasn't just a breakdown, it was the spark. I'm going to tell you how that calculated cruelty forced me to finally exist without apology, and how one man's quiet observation turned my life, and my sister's perfectly constructed control completely upside down. If you've ever felt overlooked or erased by someone close to you, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Because the greatest victory isn't revenge, it's finally becoming undeniable. We were already fighting before we even reached the ticket counter, not with shouting. Lauren never shouts. Shouting is inefficient, but with her clinical, surgical dismissiveness, that felt far worse than any argument. It was April 2024, and the air in the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was thick with the manufactured calm of efficiency and thousands of hurried strangers. The trip itself was Dad's stubborn idea, a mandatory short family vacation, a heavy-handed attempt to reconnect the daughters 9 years too late. Since Mom's passing, Lauren had instinctively filled the vacuum of leadership. She became the primary Holloway, the one who handled the estate, spoke to the bankers, and, critically, defined my role. While she managed the tangible assets, I managed the emotional debris, often scrubbing away the discomfort caused by her ruthless practicality. I was perpetually branded the one who needs more time, or the one who is too sensitive. This positioning had given her unilateral authority over my reality. As we navigated the crowded terminal, I watched her operate. Lauren, the shadow twin only because she eclipsed me, moved with the crisp authority of someone who expects deference. She didn't look back to ensure I was following. She knew I would be. My internal struggle was already churning, a familiar cocktail of resentment and the paralyzing fear of confrontation. I knew the drill. If I challenged her, I would only prove her point that I was difficult and incapable of maintaining the peace. So I kept my silence, a habit reinforced by years of subtle exclusion. My father, an emotionally distant, retired businessman, always allowed Lauren to resolve everything, further cementing my place as the passive accompaniment. The tension peaked as we approached the check-in for our international flight. The line was long, moving slowly, a perfect captive audience for what was about to unfold. I clutched my passport and my single carry-on, feeling the familiar weight of being the excess baggage in my own life. I observed the people around us, reading their micro-expressions, a skill developed from years of having to anticipate emotional shifts in my family just to survive. Just behind us stood a man who was impossible to ignore, yet seemed determined to be unseen. He was older, perhaps late 60s, dressed in subtly expensive clothes, the kind of clothes that don't scream wealth but suggest layers of it. He wasn't fiddling with his phone or complaining about the line. He was merely watching. His eyes, though focused generally forward, seemed to register every nuance of interaction, especially ours. My sister stepped up to the counter when our turn finally came. The airline attendant, a young woman with tired eyes, offered a practiced, polite smile. "Good afternoon. Passports, please. Checking any bags?" Lauren placed her passport down. Hers first, of course. "Just these 2 rolling cases," she said, indicating the bags already on the scale. "We're traveling light." The attendant began scanning Lauren's documents, then glanced up, her eyes flicking toward me, standing only 3 feet away. I was holding my own passport out, ready. "And are there just 2 of you traveling today?" the attendant asked, confirming the number. This was the micro-hook of true escalation, the moment I thought I was ready for anything she could throw at me, but didn't realize she had saved the nuclear option for a public audience. Lauren paused, a fractional delay that felt like an eternity. She didn't look at me, didn't shift her weight. Her eyes remained locked on the attendant, giving her the full, cool gaze of someone stating an obvious fact. "No," Lauren said, her voice dropping slightly to that tone she uses when correcting an assumption. "It's just the two of us here for the booking. My sister, Maya, is traveling separately." The words hit me like physical sound of air being rapidly sucked out of the room, traveling separately, as if I were a logistical error, a discarded line item on the itinerary she didn't bother to integrate. She hadn't excluded me from the conversation. She had excluded me from the very premise of the trip. The attendant looked visibly confused, her gaze darting between Lauren, who was perfectly composed, and me, standing there holding my ticket and passport, clearly part of the group moment before. The unspoken question in the attendant's eyes, why is she standing right there if she's separate? Was the true humiliation. My brain seized. I felt the familiar heat rising in my neck, the frantic urge to intervene, to assert my existence, to simply say, "No. We are together. She's just being dramatic." But years of psychological conditioning kept me silent, fearing that my attempt to occupy space would only be interpreted as disruption. I managed to push out a single word, my voice thin. "Lauren, we talked about—" Lauren cut me off with the most devastating sound in her arsenal, the heavy, impatient sigh. It wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of profound annoyance, broadcasting to everyone within earshot, the attendant, the passengers behind us, the man watching, that I was, indeed, the problem. "Don't start, Maya," she muttered, not moving her lips much. "Not today. I already told you to stop complicating things. You know the documents are different." The lie wasn't even complex. Our documents were identical. The difference was merely the seating arrangement she had deliberately manipulated months ago to keep a physical distance between us. And now she was weaponizing that difference to define our entire relationship trajectory in front of strangers. The attendant, eager to move the line, instantly deferred to the confident party, which was not me. She nodded quickly. "Understood. Just the 2 bags then. Have a good flight, ma'am." Lauren smiled, the efficient, satisfied smile of a woman who has just solved a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. She took her boarding passes and pulled her luggage off the scale, walking briskly toward the security line without a single glance in my direction. The message was clear. My existence was not her problem. I stood frozen, the heat of shame now replaced by a chilling realization. I had allowed her to erase me in public, and the public had accepted the erasure. I felt every eye on me, judging my silent acceptance of being deemed inconvenient. I slowly moved aside to allow the next passenger to approach the counter, clutching my documents that Lauren had just invalidated. I needed a moment to process the raw, acidic humiliation before I could summon the energy to manually check myself in, alone. As I took a half step back, trying to gather the pieces of my shattered composure, the man who had been waiting patiently behind us moved forward. He was tall, his suit immaculate, his silver hair neatly combed. He stopped right where Lauren had stood moments before. He didn't make eye contact with the attendant yet. Instead, he leaned in, lowering his head just enough so his voice, gravelly and low, would only reach my ears. "You know," he murmured, his tone entirely conversational, almost clinical. "She thinks she erased you." I flinched, startled that a stranger had not only witnessed the exchange, but understood the precise emotional violence of the act. He finally met my eyes. They were the intense, pale blue eyes of someone who processes data instantly. There was no pity in his gaze, only recognition. "She mistook your silence for acquiescence," he continued, still whispering, the attendant now waiting patiently for him to speak to her. He was giving me this moment, this piece of unsought validation. He paused, then delivered the final, impossible sentence, the one that broke through the years of self-doubt and fear. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a promise. It was a simple statement of conviction from a man who clearly knew the mechanisms of control. "Trust me, she'll regret it." He turned immediately, smoothly, presenting his own passport to the confused attendant, moving on with the flow of the airport as if he hadn't just spoken the most subversive lie I had ever heard. I stood there, momentarily disconnected from time. Who was this man? Why did he care? Why did his statement, spoken with absolute certainty, feel less like empty comfort and more like a directive? It was only later, when the shock wore off and I processed the distinctive details of his demeanor and attire, that I realized I had just been handed a lifeline by Richard Klein, the notoriously observant founder of the global logistics and tech conglomerate. A billionaire, observing my private humiliation and offering a promise of consequence against my dominant twin. I eventually gathered my wits, stepped back up to the counter and checked myself in separately, just as Lauren had dictated. But as I walked toward security, I didn't feel the expected pain of loneliness. I felt a sharp, thrilling spike of defiant curiosity. Richard Klein had recognized my invisibility, and instead of pitying it, he had validated my right to exist outside of Lauren's shadow. I didn't know what his words meant, or what I was supposed to trust. But for the first time in 9 years, I didn't feel discardable. I felt observed, and that observation was about to shatter my world. I had to catch up to Lauren, who was already disappearing into the metal detectors, but my mind was stuck on the man in the suit. What was his plan? And how could he possibly make Lauren, the woman who controlled everything, regret anything at all? The turbulence of the day wasn't over. By some bizarre twist of fate, or perhaps a simple anonymous failure of the airline's complex seating system, my assigned seat was reallocated, and I found myself being directed not to the back of the plane, but to an unexpected upgrade. I was directed to the very front, the business class cabin, and there, settled comfortably by the window, was the man who had witnessed my erasure, the billionaire who had whispered a lie. I was placed directly beside Richard Klein. The flight attendant simply apologized for the inconvenience, having no idea she had just seated the victim next to the only witness who had dared to speak up. The next leg of my journey, the quiet escalation of a silent war, was about to begin above the clouds. The pressurized cabin of the Boeing felt less like transportation and more like an observation chamber, isolating me from the bustling drama of the terminal, and critically, isolating me from my sister. The unexpected reallocation of my seat, a simple error in the system they claimed, though I knew better, had placed me beside Richard Klein, the silent billionaire who had watched my public annihilation and offered a cryptic prophecy. He was already seated, reading financial reports displayed on a tablet that glowed with a cool, expensive light. The luxury of the first-class compartment was a stark contrast to the churning anxiety I carried, a reminder of the two separate worlds Lauren and I had always inhabited, even when standing side by side. Now, separated by a thin curtain from the rest of the plane, and by an emotional chasm from my family, I felt exposed. I settled into the oversized chair, the leather pristine and cold against my skin. I avoided looking at him directly, focusing instead on the geometry of the wing outside the small window, trying to regulate the frantic rhythm of my heart. He didn't force conversation. That was the first thing I noticed. The total absence of the kind of aggressive, demanding presence that usually accompanied wealth and power, the kind of presence Lauren always cultivated. Richard Klein was simply there, existing without demanding notice. After the plane reached cruising altitude and the initial flurry of service subsided, he lowered his tablet slowly, placing it carefully on the side table. His movement was deliberate, economical. He turned his head toward me, and those eyes, which had been so acutely observant at the check-in counter, held a quality that was neither pity nor judgment, but pure, unadulterated curiosity. "You have the look of someone who has spent a long time apologizing for being present," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that required no effort to hear over the drone of the engines. It wasn't a question, it was a statement based on observation. I flinched internally. That was my core fear articulated by a complete stranger, the fear of being inconvenient, the belief that, if I occupy space, I will disrupt. I managed a weak, dismissive shrug, hoping to close the door on the topic. "It's been a long day." He nodded, accepting the deflection, but did not let the observation go. "The check-in counter was interesting. Your sister believes control is oxygen, But control, Maya, requires a subject willing to be controlled. She redefined reality for the attendant. We are just the two of us. And for a moment, the external world accepted that you were a system error. The remarkable thing wasn't her arrogance, but your silence. My throat tightened. My lifelong pattern of calculated self-abnegation was being dissected under the sterile light of objectivity. I just wanted to avoid a scene, I whispered, the familiar excuse rising instinctively to my lips. A scene, he repeated, savoring the word. So, you preferred the silent erasure over the brief inconvenience of asserting your existence. That is the habit of someone who has been consistently penalized for having needs. The raw accuracy of his analysis stunned me. My entire family history, the years of subtle exclusions, the persistent narrative that I was the sensitive one who needed more time, all crystallized in that one sentence. Lauren didn't need to scream. She just needed me to believe that raising my voice was more catastrophic than disappearing. He finally asked his first real question, the kind of question that felt invasive simply because it demanded an answer from a part of me I kept locked away. What do you want, Maya Holloway? Not what your father thinks you should want. Not what Lauren tells you is possible. What does the person who avoids confrontation desperately yearn for? I wanted to say peace, but the word tasted false. The truth, the deep, embarrassing truth, was that I wanted to be recognized without having to beg for it. I wanted to exist without needing permission. The silence stretched, filled only by the engine's monotonous roar. You are worried about being discarded, he stated, cutting through my internal struggle. That fear is why you make yourself small, but being small only confirms to the world that you are disposable. I looked at him then, truly seeing Richard Klein for the first time, not the billionaire, but the man who saw patterns. He hadn't mentioned his whisper at the airport, the promise that she would regret it, but now I understood its weight. It wasn't a threat of intervention, but a quiet conviction that if I stopped managing her emotional comfort by minimizing myself, the natural consequences of her controlling behavior would inevitably find her. He wasn't promising vengeance, he was promising inevitability. The conversation that followed wasn't counseling, nor was it networking. It was an intellectual dissection of human dependency and control. He talked little about his technology conglomerate, focusing instead on logistics and leverage. He explained that most people mistake activity for progress and mistake volume for authority. Lauren was volume and activity. I, according to him, had the rare ability to read the precise emotional landscape of a room, a silent observational skill honed by years of walking on familial eggshells. That, he posited, was a form of leverage. The greatest leverage is often recognition, he concluded, just as the plane began its descent over the cloudy expanse of the Pacific Northwest. Recognition of your own value first, and then strategically allowing the right people to recognize it externally. Do not confuse invisibility with safety. When we landed at Seattle-Tacoma, the shift was immediate. Richard Klein offered a curt nod, a quiet, "Good luck, Maya," and disappeared into the stream of high-priority deplaning passengers. Just like that, the mentor figure, the catalyst, vanished, leaving me alone with the uncomfortable, sharp edges of my new reality. My family was waiting near baggage claim, a tableau of strained familial unity. Lauren immediately sought to reassert control, her eyes sharp and cold. She didn't ask where I had been. She simply stated, "Finally, Maya, you took long enough. We need to stick to the schedule. Dad is tired." I felt the familiar urge to apologize, to smooth the waters, to fall back into the role of the passive, grateful second fiddle. But the memory of Richard's words, "Do not confuse invisibility with safety," held me steady. I met her gaze, held it, and simply said, "The seating was changed. I just arrived." No apology, no explanation for the delay, no permission sought. The immediate reaction was negligible, but significant. Lauren blinked, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her face. My father, preoccupied with arranging the transport, didn't notice. But Lauren had expected the typical flurry of excuses, the attempt to manage her irritation. By offering a neutral fact instead of an apology, I had denied her the satisfaction of reestablishing dominance. It was a minor victory, a silent refusal to play the assigned role. The next few days in Seattle were characterized by this quiet, shifting tension. We were there for a family trip, but the atmosphere was thick with professional anxiety. Lauren was obsessed with a massive logistics contract she was lobbying for, a project that would solidify her position at her firm and finally silence any family member who might dare suggest I was her professional equal. She spent hours sequestered in the rental condo, making high-stakes calls, her voice tight with calculated confidence. I, meanwhile, felt detached, observing the family ritual from a distance, feeling the weight of my own identity crisis. I had spent so long defined by my relationship to Lauren, the shadow, the sensitive twin, that asserting a standalone identity felt like shedding a layer of skin, painful and exposed. And then, the system began to correct itself. It happened late on Wednesday evening. I was reading in my small bedroom, trying to find a peaceful corner away from Lauren's constant low-level stress, when an email notification popped up on my phone. An external consulting firm, one I had submitted a vague proposal 2 months ago and promptly forgotten about. The subject line was succinct. Project Neptune status update, hold and review. Curiosity piqued, I clicked. The email wasn't addressed to me, but clearly copied me. It was an internal memo detailing a sudden, unexplained freezing of Project Neptune, the very contract Lauren had been relentlessly pursuing. The memo cited structural redundancies and conflicts of interest that require immediate reevaluation of the primary vendor relationship. My stomach clenched. This felt dangerous. I knew, with the chilling certainty of a twin who understands every tremor of the other, that this was Lauren's project. But why was I copied? A minute later, a second email landed in my inbox, this one addressed directly to me from a completely different firm, an emerging competitor in logistics technology. The subject line was far warmer. Offer of independent consulting partnership, Project Oracle. I opened it, my hands shaking slightly. The proposal outlined a similar, but smaller logistics project that required deep, precise emotional and operational intelligence, the kind of intelligence Richard Klein had suggested was my specialty. The email explicitly mentioned my unique perspective on system inefficiencies and human factors, terminology that felt unnervingly familiar. My proposal, which I had written months ago and believed was too niche, had been approved. The email concluded with a highly competitive offer, recognizing my independent expertise and autonomy. It was not revenge. It was recognition, directed and channeled. It was the external world reacting not to Lauren's volume but to my presence. It was Richard Klein's influence, not in a direct threat, but in a quiet, logistical redirection of opportunity. He hadn't destroyed Lauren. He had simply made sure that when the system looked for expertise, it couldn't help but see me. I sat in stunned silence, the paper-thin wall separating me from Lauren's room amplifying the sound of her pacing. I could feel her frustration radiating through the drywall. She was wrestling with her phone, likely trying to decode the sudden hold on her massive project. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For years, I believed I had to apologize for every success, every opinion, every space I occupied. Now, success was being delivered to my virtual doorstep without me having to knock, simply because I had refused to be erased at an airport. It took Lauren nearly 2 hours to piece together the truth, and when she did, she didn't come to me screaming. She came to me with a controlled, surgical fury that was far more terrifying. I was sitting at the small dining table, trying to appear nonchalant while my mind raced when she entered the room. She held her phone like a weapon, the screen displaying the internal memo about Project Neptune, and below it, the header of my own consulting contract for Project Oracle. Oracle, she stated, her voice unnaturally flat, devoid of the dramatic inflection she usually employed to signal high-stakes family drama. Convenient, isn't it, Maya? Neptune is stalled, but your tiny, niche project suddenly gets funded, targeting the exact same market demographic. You did this, didn't you? Her accusation was delivered not as a question, but as a statement of fact that she expected me to instantly deny or minimize. She was waiting for the familiar dance, her anger, my self-effacing apology, my nervous retreat. I looked up at her, my heart hammering, but my expression remained steady. I didn't smile, Didn't gloat, didn't feel the need to defend myself. This was the silent inversion. I was no longer fighting for space. I was simply occupying it. I didn't stall your project, Lauren, I replied calmly, my voice steady and low. My contract was approved based on merit. I assume yours was stalled based on the structural redundancies they cited. I watched her face carefully, reading the complex blend of outrage and dawning realization. Don't give me that measured tone, Maya. You're playing games now. Did you find a way to undermine me? Who did you talk to on that flight? I know you were sitting next to some kind of VIP. You found that VIP convenient, didn't you? I interjected, still calm, refusing to escalate. You found my presence inconvenient at the check-in counter, Lauren. You told the attendant we were only 2 people. You erased me in front of strangers, employees, and cameras because you believed that if you occupied the center, I had to disappear. I paused, letting the silence fill the sterile air of the rental unit. This was the moment of reckoning. The first time in 35 years I had held up the mirror without flinching. You erased me because you thought no one would notice, I finished. But you didn't erase me, Lauren. You just pushed me out of your shadow. And now, the world is noticing. She didn't have a response. She didn't have the tools to deal with unadorned truth delivered without malice or fear. Her efficiency, her control, her ability to redefine reality, all relied on my complicity, on my willingness to be the controllable variable. When I refused to play the victim, she had nothing left to manage. She simply stood there, phone trembling slightly in her hand, staring at the twin she thought she had successfully turned into a ghost. Her expression was a chaotic mix of fury and, for the first time, profound uncertainty. She could control narratives, but she couldn't control recognition. And that, I realized, was the beginning of her deepest regret. The billionaire's whisper was coming true, not through sabotage, but through clarity. The game had changed, and I was finally playing on my own terms. That day, my twin sister didn't just forget me, she publicly declared me irrelevant, a glitch in the perfect system she called our family. But before the dust settled, before I could fully absorb the humiliation, a billionaire whispered a lie, or perhaps the truth I desperately needed to hear. Trust me, she'll regret it. I'm Maya Holloway, the one who always made herself smaller, believing occupying space was an inconvenience, a burden to everyone around me. What followed was not an act of revenge, but a silent inversion, a total internal collapse and rebuild, where my need for maintaining peace finally died, replaced by the simple, terrifying necessity of presence. If you've ever felt like you had to disappear to keep the peace, hit the like button right now and subscribe, because the end of this story shows that sometimes being pushed away is the only way to find your true center. But the real journey didn't start with the destination. It started with the questions Richard Klein asked me at 30,000 feet, questions delivered with the kind of casual curiosity most people reserve for weather reports. He didn't ask about my sister, didn't criticize my father, and didn't offer sympathy. Instead, he asked me about the complex logistics model I had briefly mentioned years ago to Lauren, a model she immediately dismissed as too theoretical and unnecessary. He remembered the theoretical, the inconvenient, the details I had deemed too fragile to defend. He asked why I was afraid of having good ideas, why I accepted the role of a permanent observer, why I had internalized the idea that if I were to suddenly succeed, it would somehow destabilize the universe. The conversation was like intellectual emergency surgery. He wasn't healing the wound of the airport. He was identifying the tumor of self-sabotage that had allowed the wound to fester for 3 decades. I walked off that plane carrying not just my carry-on bag, but the crushing weight of realization. My invisibility wasn't fate. It was the perfectly executed consequence of a script I had willingly co-written. Richard gave me a single, nondescript business card belonging to a third-party consulting agency affiliated with his network, and his only instruction was, submit the work you are already doing, Maya, not the work you think someone else wants you to do. The most dangerous kind of change is the one that happens without any fanfare, entirely out of sight, and that is precisely how I began to occupy my new, terrifying space. while we were ostensibly enjoying our family rapprochement trip in Seattle. Navigating tourist sites and awkward family dinners dominated by Lauren's updates on her major professional goal, a massive, high-profile contract we'll call Project Phoenix. I was secretly channeling every ounce of observational energy and repressed intellectual capability into that nondescript business card. I began working on my logistics model, the one Lauren had mocked, now tailored to solve a major pain point in supply chain distribution. I worked in the quiet hours between midnight and 4 a.m., hunched over a borrowed laptop in the hotel business center, feeling the icy grip of panic constantly tightening my chest. Every calculated spreadsheet, every line of code, felt like a public declaration of war against my own fundamental belief system. Se eu ocupar espaço, vou atrapalhar. The fear of failing publicly was immense, but for the first time, it was eclipsed by the devastating fear of confirming Lauren's public assessment of me, that I was disposable, a separate variable, irrelevant. I submitted the complete proposal under the guise of an independent consultant, using a pseudonym for the first contact, following the specific, strange instructions on Richard's card. There were no promises, no guarantees of success, only the terrifying thrill of putting my existence on the line without a safety net. I was still half expecting the universe to snatch the project away, to remind me that I wasn't allowed to have anything major, anything that eclipsed the narrative set by my dominant sister. The family trip was wrapping up. We were scheduled to fly home the next morning. Our final dinner was at a notoriously upscale Seattle restaurant, filled with the usual tension. Lauren was visibly stressed, fixated on her phone, expecting a major update on Project Phoenix. Our father, perpetually distant, sipped wine, occasionally asking rhetorical questions about the market. The air was thick with Lauren's anticipated victory. And then, the news broke. Not the news Lauren wanted, but the news that shifted the tectonic plates beneath our family table. Lauren received the first devastating text. Project Phoenix, the massive undertaking she had poured 6 months of her life into securing, was officially frozen, delayed indefinitely due to unforeseen internal reorganization. Her face went pale, the mask of controlled efficiency cracking dramatically. She murmured something about incompetence and corruption, her fear of losing relevance momentarily surfacing. Then, before she could launch into her usual tirade about how unfair the world was, the second piece of information arrived. It was delivered not via text, but through a notification on the business news ticker displayed silently on the wall television near our table, a small, almost clinical announcement regarding a subsidiary of Klein Global, a name my father instantly recognized, nodding vaguely. Approving a pilot program focused on revolutionary small-scale logistics consultation. The independent consultant hired to oversee the implementation. The name scrolling across the screen was Maya Holloway. The shock was absolute. It wasn't just the success that hit Lauren, it was the silence of it. The success hadn't come through nepotism or pleading. It was an officially documented achievement, a project that existed entirely outside her sphere of influence, in a related field that suddenly rendered her frozen project obsolete. My name, Maya Holloway, was printed alongside Richard Klein's corporate umbrella. The realization that I had achieved something significant, not despite her shadow, but because I had finally moved away from it, was the ultimate psychological blow. My father, who had spent a decade seeing me only as the sensitive one, stammered a half-hearted, "Well, Maya, that's certainly something." But his voice was lost in the vacuum of Lauren's staring silence. The explosion wasn't immediate, but the suffocating silence that followed the announcement was louder than any fight we'd ever had. Later that night, Lauren cornered me in the hotel hallway, her eyes cold, her body rigid, every fiber of her being demanding control over this rogue variable I had introduced. "How dare you?" She didn't shout, she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, imbued with a toxic mix of disbelief and betrayal. "You manipulated this. Who did you sleep with? You used the family name. You used Dad's retirement fund. You must have promised Klein something enormous. Tell me the truth, Maya. You are a consultant. You don't have this kind of clout. Confess what lie you told, what manipulation you deployed." She couldn't process that my success was internal. It had to be external, a trick, a cheat she hadn't detected. Her usual arsenal failed. I didn't defend the project. I didn't mention Richard Klein. I didn't apologize for my success. I simply looked at my twin sister, the person who knew exactly where to touch to make me feel small. And for the first time, I felt the space between us, not as a separation, but as a necessary boundary. I found the words that Richard's questions had prepared me to deliver. You want to know how I did it, Lauren? You taught me how. At the airport, you told everyone I traveled separately, that I was an inconvenience, a separate variable. You achieved exactly what you wanted. You successfully erased me from your life, from your story, from your expected destination. I paused, letting the full weight of her actions settle between us. But you forgot one thing. She who is officially erased has nothing to lose and no narrative to adhere to. I was free. Free from having to manage your expectations, free from fitting into your designated space. You thought you had permanently erased me, Lauren, but you merely pushed me out of your shadow. And it turns out the sunlight out here is far more profitable. Lauren didn't respond. She had no counter-argument. She couldn't redefine the success, the external validation of Klein Global, or the simple fact that I was now an independent, recognized entity. Her greatest fear, losing relevance and control, was staring her in the face, orchestrated by the one person she had deemed weakest and most predictable. She turned, walking away not in a huff, but in a strange, defeated silence that spoke volumes. The confrontation was over in minutes, but the consequences lasted a lifetime. Richard Klein never spoke to me again after that project was underway. He didn't offer partnership, mentorship, or friendship. He simply observed, catalyzed, and vanished, having fulfilled his promise that she would regret her actions. His intervention wasn't about vengeance. It was about providing a brief window of opportunity for me to prove my competence to myself. The greatest change wasn't professional, though that project did launch a successful independent career. The greatest change was internal. Today, my relationship with Lauren is minimal, a conscious choice made not out of spite, but out of clarity. We are twins who share DNA, but not a narrative. I established boundaries not to punish her, but to protect my newfound presence. I learned that being erased wasn't my destiny. It was the role I had allowed others to cast me in. The fear of being disposable dissolved because I chose to become essential to myself first. I am no longer the shadow of anyone, not a copy, not an excess. I am presence. I occupy the space. I exist without asking for permission, finding the simple, profound relief of finally being the main character in my own story. This story, like all dramatic narratives, is fictionalized and dramatized, but the pain of emotional erasure, the subtle dynamics of familial invalidation, and the struggle for autonomy against imposed roles are intensely real. The transformation I went through, the silent, terrifying process of claiming my own space, is an experience shared by countless people trapped in the shadow of someone dominant. The freedom we seek often lies not in achieving external victory over our oppressors, but in accepting the isolation that sometimes comes from defining and upholding the roles we choose for ourselves, rather than the ones others impose. Have you ever realized your worst fear, like being disposable, was actually the prerequisite for your greatest act of strength? What was the moment you decided to stop shrinking yourself for others, and how did your world change? What is the one word you would use to define your fight for self-worth? I want you to tell me exactly how this story resonated with you. Write the word presence down in the comments below. Let me know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video. Subscribe if you haven't, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the final story in this series, and share this with anyone who needs to be reminded that they are not disposable. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.